those. All righty, perfect. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And so honored that back on the program in our second to last final show of this season before 1+1 takes a hiatus and we all go on our Christmas, New Year, Christmas, New Year's holidays. We have back on the program Jesus Rodriguez, the editor-in-chief of Orinoco Tribune, and Saheli Chowdhury, a contributor and part of the editorial team at Orinoco Tribune. And of course, yes, we're here to discuss Latin American affairs, all things Latin America episode. And let's get to it. So first, Jesus and Saheli, thank you so much for coming back on the program. And sorry for the last minute rescheduling and all that and all sorts of drama behind the scenes.
No, thank you, Youri, for calling us and having this program. I mean, it's always wonderful to be on your show.
Likewise, always an honor to have you on the program. And just before we get to the specific Latin American country I wanted to talk to you about, which is Peru, also wanted an update on what's going on in Bolivia. And also Venezuela. We have to talk about Venezuela. But just before we talk about all of that, I have to ask, because Sunday, the World Cup concluded with an Argentine victory over France. Jesus, you being based in Caracas, I'm sure, with a certain Argentinian diaspora community there, I'm sure that the feeling among them and all of Latin America is they are probably overjoyed with Argentina winning the World Cup, because a win for Argentina is also a win for Latin America, right? Or
Absolutely. There was celebration here in Venezuela because of the victory of Argentina. So a lot of people were watching. I believe that most of the country was watching the game last Sunday. So we enjoyed. We suffered. We enjoyed the game was. I mean, the match was pretty intense.
Yeah, yes,
especially
it was.
In the last part. And everyone enjoyed it, and absolutely it is as you say. I mean, disregarding that some people might have like patriotism or chauvinistic behaviors in many parts of the world, including Latin America. Many of us enjoy having a Latin American country winning the World Cup, especially because of the arrogancy of the people in Europe, that they believe that they are better because they are white and whatever, and they have killed more people.
That is true. There is a lot of truth to that. But then a quick follow-up question that I have to ask this question, and of course, congratulations to Argentina. It was a very fair game. Both France and Argentina did very well, and what looks like was going to be a very dull game of an easy Argentina victory, it later picked up and it later became a very intense, epic game. So I say congratulations to both France and Argentina, and I'm glad that France, even though there was I'm glad that France and the team are being welcomed as heroes as they go back to the country and so forth. And so congratulations all around. But then I have to ask this question, which is what did you both make of the controversial politics that marred this entire World Cup? There was a lot of strong voices denouncing that Qatar was allowed to host this, given their human rights, trafficking, terrible mistreatment of migrant workers. And I certainly denounced Qatar for exporting ISIS and other Wahhabi death squads into Libya and Syria. And of course, some of their patriarchal, heteronormative policies. But many people, surprisingly, many leftists I know actually defended Qatar, saying that once more this was the West, saying that the West was wrong to single out a country, and also many people made the fact that we're still making deals with Qatar, we're still friends with the Saudi Arabian theocracy, and yet the West is singling out Iran for its patriarchal and theocratic policy. So where did both of you lie? Because I'll be honest, for me, there was no right or wrong. There was no right or wrong answer. I felt everyone had a very good point. The US, Britain, and Canada are the leading purveyors of violence and wage aggressive imperial wars constantly. They prop up the very people that they tell us that we're supposed to, denounce in, social media lynch mobs. And I thought it was weird how Iran's players were told that they must denounce their government, and yet, Colin Kaepernick back in the US, he still is blacklisted, and I didn't see anybody demanding that, like, the US, Britain, and Canada, not sing their national anthems.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, there was the issue of taking a knee, the whole not being allowed to wear the One Love, banner. But there was a lot of strong Palestine solidarity. So, like I said, for me, I'm agnostic. Everybody had a very good arguments when it came to Qatar hosting the World Cup and so forth. So for me, for the first time, I actually was very agnostic on this topic. So no right or wrong answers. Curious what you both thought of all of that.
Well, actually, I don't think anybody would turn a blind eye towards the violation of human rights or the violation of migrant workers' rights, etc. in Qatar. What people were pointing out, those especially on the left, is that the West is hypocritical when it is talking about human rights, migrants' rights, talking about anything at all when it came to Qatar, especially because of the fact, like you mentioned, that West is still friends with Qatar. Of course, there is this scandal regarding bribery and all, because of which the European Union Qatar deal about gas and oil is in jeopardy. I don't think it will happen. So it is the main thing that people pointed out, including the Venezuelan government, is that the West is exhibiting the pinnacle of hypocrisy when it is criticizing Qatar about things that it itself indulges in. So,
exactly.
For example, the next edition of the World Cup is going to be hosted by the US, Canada, and Mexico. So let's see. I would like to see similar sort of criticisms and protests by players, by very people who were protesting about this Qatar thing in the US, in Canada, outside the venues. For example, in US and in Canada, I don't think you would be allowed to raise the Palestinian flag in the stadium, right? Well, it is banned all over the European Union. UEFA bans lifting the Palestinian flag in the stadiums, and
do they? So yeah, go ahead. Explain.
Yes.
Explain.
Yes.
I actually did not know this.
The Football Regulatory Committee of the European Union, which is the UEFA, it actually bans the lifting of Palestinian flag in the stadiums, and it fines teams if their supporters lift the Palestinian flag in the stadium. So this is actually, this is true. Yes, it does not, no European country recognizes Palestine as a country. They give money to UNRWA, of course, but that's all that they do. They are in bed with Israel. So they would seriously not allow lifting the Palestinian flag. Also, for example, they were talking about human rights abuses in Qatar. They were not talking about the support of UAE in the war in Yemen. Were they? They weren't. So they were not really talking about the things that the West has backed financially, politically, diplomatically, all these countries, say UAE, Qatar, the Saudi, etc., to do in the region. Like, these countries are actually US vassals in West Asia and North Africa. So, this was more like a show for me. It was more like a show by the West. The points raised were okay, but it was a show from the West. And also another thing about this, for example, some people were talking about not being allowed to consume alcoholic drinks in stadiums. Well, in most countries of the world, you will not be allowed to do that for law and order reasons. Okay? Like, in most countries, you won't be allowed to do that because the police already, there is a lot of lot of emotions among people when they're watching the football game, right?
Yeah.
So add alcohol to that, and it will be a mess. So it will be a law and order situation. That is why it's not allowed in many countries of the world. I know that nowhere in Asia it's allowed, irrespective of what sort of government you have in the countries.
Interesting. Okay.
They also talked about
many people do not know that either. Okay, so that's also interesting in and of itself.
It's not allowed in consuming alcohol in public is illegal in India, in China, in Bangladesh, in many countries. Like these are all countries that are not theocratic, and it's not allowed here.
Yeah, I agree with Saheli, and I just would add that it's the hypocrisy and the white supremacy thing behind all that criticism against Qatar, you know? I mean, it's the Eurocentristic, cosmovision that makes the whiteys in the North believe that whatever happens outside their boundaries is bad. And should be criticized. So in that sense, I believe that's the most important thing. I mean, corruption is something that has been there forever. I mean, no one will tell me that corruption begins with Qatar. I mean, I'm talking about FIFA corruption and things like that. I mean, I don't believe that this is the first time there was money involved in the selection of a venue for the FIFA, for the World Cup. So I mean, it's important to highlight that. The same thing with the migrant trafficking and exploitation. I mean, come on, that happened all over the Gulf, all over the Arabic Gulf, and no one criticized that when it is Abu Dhabi or something like that. So I mean, it's the hypocrisy behind the scene, and not wanting us in the global South to be also part of these kind of events and show and showcase ourselves, and because they are used to rule the world. I mean, it's basically white supremacy, if you ask me.
And well, now that, and Sahel, you mentioned the thing about Palestine. So that's okay. So now I understand why people were making such a big deal about the fact that there were so many Palestinian flags. Because for me, I was like, why is everybody so obsessed with I mean, it wouldn't surprise me that there would be Palestinian solidarity in a place like Qatar, regardless of what's going on behind the scenes between the Qatari ruling family and Israel. But the fact that she mentioned that Palestinian flags are actually banned, like you're not allowed to wave them anywhere in Europe, and certainly in the US, that would be a huge no. So the fact that you mentioned that, that makes more sense why Palestinian solidarity voices were like, wow, this is amazing, and so forth. But then, very quick follow-up before we get to before we talk about what's happening in Peru, then what would you then say to somebody, somebody like the queer, somebody who's involved in queer liberation politics, who says I completely agree with you both that the U.S. and the U.K. and Canada are very hypocritical to be using our plight as a way to weaponize Qatar, single out Qatar, and so forth like that, as well as sexism and whatever human rights deficiency do exist in Qatar. But isn't it better? Isn't it better that the plight of queer folks, women, and so forth are raised are raised against Qatar? Isn't it better to raise that issue as opposed to not raising it at all, and we all just put our heads in the sand and all think that it's hunky dory, a country like Qatar is hosting the World Cup? What would you say? What would you say is somebody like that?
No, actually, we didn't think that. Nobody actually thought that. I mean, Qatar is one of the worst places for human rights abuses in the world. So nobody was thinking that, I think, as well as the fact you mentioned. No, people were not talking, like those in the West were not really talking about women's rights in Qatar. They were talking about queer rights, and not even that rights. They were like, we are not being allowed to wear the One Love armband, etc. Well, that is also not allowed in many places, irrespective of what laws they have. Okay, like the homosexuality is not criminalized in countries, there are many where you may not be allowed to wear that band, again for law and order reasons. Nobody wants a fight in the stadium, etc. So there are many reasons that people don't do it. Of course, in Qatar there are all sorts of abuses, but people are not really talking about women's rights in Qatar. They didn't. And women are more than half of the world, definitely more than half of the population of Qatar, and yet nobody was mentioning that. They did talk about workers' rights abuses. Well, the same sort of workers' rights abuses exist in the US, for example. Migrants' rights abuses, well, they do. Like the migrants who entered the US illegally or tried to enter it illegally, undocumented migrants, they are actually placed in prisons, privately run prisons, where they are made to work like slaves. So the military industrial prison complex actually profits from slave migrant labor, very similar to what happens in Qatar, and very similar to the agents who exist in these places, like in South Asia, for example, from where most workers go to Qatar. So it's very similar to these agents. There are agents in South America and Central America who do send these people into the US, try to send them illegally. So these, just like those people are paid and maintained by US authorities, these agents, etc., these are also paid and maintained by the authorities of Saudi, Qatar, etc. And exploitation of workers, irrespective of whether they're migrants or not, will continue in the capitalist system. So it's not just I am criticizing these policies without criticizing the entire system. So like I said, it's hypocrisy, it's a show and all that. No, we will protest against, like we will criticize Qatar for its deficiencies, as you call them, but we will also point out the hypocrisy of the West, because they have all those deficiencies 100 times over.
Fantastic.
Yes, I agree with this, Saheli. I mean, it's basically going back to your question, is like, of course, I mean, if you really are fighting for human rights, rights of women, rights of LGBTQ community, right of exploiting migrants, right of whomever, that's okay. But if you do it, just because of identity politics, or you won't change too much, because at the end of the day, the problem is the capitalist system that creates the conditions for this. And also, if you do it, yes, out of the blue, because of mainstream media propaganda, which is what happened with Qatar, that people that don't know a thing about Qatar, but they just read a few talking points here and there because of mainstream media put that in their head, and they are now the defenders of women's rights in Qatar or whatever. I mean, that's hypocrisy. That's trending topics and social media BS and that is injected in the people just to replicate the way of thinking of the people in the North also. So I would have just said that.
Well, like I said, I think everybody had very good arguments, and everything that you both just said that I just learned now, yeah, completely right. So for me, there's no right or wrong answers, and I think very fair arguments, in that regards. And all right, and on to the next topic at hand, and yeah, so on to the next topic at hand, which is Saheli, and yeah, we'll do this. Saheli, you can explain, and then we'll rotate with Jesus. Now, tell us what's been going on in Peru. This is a Latin American country which deserved far more attention than what was given, but now there's a lot of attention on it. And sadly, we saw, we see that the left is making huge gains in Bolivia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Chile to an extent, Brazil, Colombia, and Argentina, but there still are many parts of the region which are under the boots of Uncle Sam, the Crown in the UK, Canada, and their allies. So tell us, what is going on in Peru where, once again, sadly, a democratically elected leftist leader has sadly been unseated? And yes, tell us all about it.
So firstly, the whole region is, irrespective of how the left is faring in each country, the whole region is still under the boots of Uncle Sam and its allies. Yes, because when especially at this time in the geopolitical arena, Uncle Sam has contenders, like legitimate contenders like China and Russia, which it considers threats. Okay, so at times like this, it's few redirects to Latin America, because that is its backyard, it's everything, like as it said in the Monroe Doctrine, that the entire continent of the Americas, this is the only time that they talk about the continent of America. The entire continent of America should belong to the Americans, but those in the US. So of course, this is something that exists in the entire region, and it is of this that Peru has been the latest victim, though sadly, probably not the last.
Yeah.
What has been going on in Peru? If we just talk about the last year, for example, just the last year, not much. Like a lot of things has been happening in Peru. Peru has always been a country from where the US, Canada, and many countries of Europe have exploited in order to gain the primary resources, especially, oil and silver, tin, a lot of things.
Mining.
And now there is lithium. So its mining interests are big in Peru. And this is like a neo-colonial system through which the country continues to be exploited. Like it was never economically independent in its 200 years of independence. So, but we were talking about just the last year and not the last 200 years. So just remember that the last presidential election in Peru in 2021 was a very turbulent thing, because first of all, it's always turbulent because the electorate is always very fractured in Peru. So Castillo, who was like the dark horse, like in Orinoco Tribune, people were calling him my dark horse. But anyway, so yeah, because I had written something and I had mentioned him that he could be the dark horse. Anyway, so
okay,
this person who, like, a lot of people don't even know him, like from where he came, etc. So he comes from a small village in department called Cajamarca, is in the southern part of Peru, and it's also a rural and mining department. He was a teacher, and like a teacher in a rural school. So just remember, he's also indigenous, and indigenous peoples of Peru since before independence, but also after independence, have always been like a second-class citizen. So when he was running as a presidential candidate, there was already a lot of racism against him, which exists. Like in Peru, if you look at the country and if you look at the demographic map, you will see that in the urban centers, especially in Lima, which is a very populated city, the capital, but also in a few more urban centers like Cusco, for example, there is a very racist and classist segregation of the regions, So you will have in the like in the most developed parts of those cities, the richer, whiter people living there. They do consider themselves white, they do consider themselves European, and many actually consider Southern Europeans to be black also. So like there are many people from like UK, from Germany, from Sweden, etc. So there are people from those origins living in Peru, and they consider themselves more European than Peruvian. And so these people, like there is this xenophobia, there is this segregation, like there is for example, in Lima itself, there is a wall, the real wall that separates rich people and poor people. It's called el muro de la vergüenza, like the wall of shame. So this exists.
Okay.
So that it is in this context that the election was happening. So it was a very polarized election with a very fractured electorate. And in April of 2021, like Pedro Castillo, who was recently ousted in a coup. So this person was like the first person, like the top one in the election, first round of the presidential election. So he and the person who was in the second, Keiko Fujimori, she is the daughter of the dictator Alberto Fujimori. This person, Alberto Fujimori, is in prison serving time for human rights abuses during his reign. So this woman, Keiko Fujimori, this was her third time running for the presidency and losing for the third time also. So she refused to concede victory to Castillo when he won in the second round. And you remember, like for 2 months, she was going to courts. She was trying to influence the electoral authorities not to declare elections, like not to declare the results, not to declare Castillo the winner. And there were people, the supporters of, not just supporters of Castillo, but supporters, like the people who had voted for him, the poor people, the rural people, indigenous people, the forgotten people, the nobodies, they were in the streets trying to defend the election results. So it was even before he took office that the right wing in Peru, which is a very fascist right wing, was planning to remove him if he won the presidency, which he did. And he assumed charge on 28th of July, 2021. Now let's remember, like the powers of state in Peru are there is the presidency, there is the legislative assembly of the parliament, it's called the Congress, and then there is the judiciary, and then there are the security forces, which is supposed, like security forces is supposed to be under the presidency, but it is actually controlled by the right wing.
Yes.
So the Congress did not, like in the Congress, the left did not get a majority. It was a fraction, but it was a majority right, center-right presidency, like the Congress. So from day one, the parliament was opposed to Castillo. The parliament from day one tried to remove him. They were not trying to let him govern. They were like calling him a terrorist. They were calling his ministers terrorists. They had threatened not to give a vote of confidence to the ministry, like the entire cabinet, so that like Castillo, although they finally ended up giving it the vote of confidence so that the cabinet could start working, he was forced many times not to do what he had promised to do. He had promised a constituent assembly, for example. Now, in the beginning, the prime minister, who was the first prime minister of Castillo, Guido Bellido, he declared that there will be a constituent assembly and like a referendum for a constituent assembly, because people will collect signatures and then they will vote that we need a constituent assembly. Now, why do they need a constituent assembly? We'll come later. But anyway, so the Congress, what it did was, I say that it is majority right wing. It passed a bill in the Congress that it itself will have the power to say whether it will accept or reject the results of a referendum. Like if people want a constituent assembly, and if people say, yes, we do want a constituent assembly, they reserve the power to accept or reject it, which they cannot do. But the judiciary, like it was done with the blessing of the judiciary, with the prosecutor, the attorney general, all of them. So they're also right-wingers. You know? So what happened is that it continued, and this Congress tried to remove Castillo from power thrice through this thing called moral incapacity. Now, in the Constitution of Peru, from the 1993 Constitution, remember, it was actually like elaborated in the time of Fujimori. So Fujimori reigned from 1990 to 2000, 10 years. In 1993, this constitution was passed. So it is a Fujimorista, very right-wing constitution, very fascist constitution. So in this constitution, there is this, like there are only two ways a president can be impeached. One is a physical discapacity. So if a person becomes incapacitated to carry out his or her charges, so in that case, it is a temporary suspension. The president can be reinstated once they they get healed from whatever they're suffering. And the second one is called moral incapacity, but it is permanent. And nobody describes what moral incapacity is. So a president could be removed for any reason because of moral incapacity. In the past, presidents were removed for corruption on this permanent moral incapacity. Presidents were removed from many things. They wanted to remove Castillo for permanent moral incapacity just because, just saying that he cannot govern, when they were not letting him govern themselves. So, and this was they tried it thrice. The third time was when they could do it. Okay, so, and they also had tried to remove him with something called traición a la patria, like betraying the homeland, because he had expressed sympathy with Bolivia's demand of access to the sea. Now, once upon a time, Bolivia was not landlocked. It lost its maritime province, Antofagasta, to Chile in 1887 in the War of the Pacific. So Peru also lost some of its southern part to Chile with the help of UK. UK was helping Chile in that war. Anyway, so Bolivia has always demanded an access to the sea, and Castillo expressed his sympathy for this reason. And for this, just for expressing sympathy, he was branded a traitor to the country. So they had tried to remove him by this way also. They could not, because they could not get the number of votes. You have to get 2/3 of the votes in the Congress in order to impeach a president. So that means 87 votes in the Peruvian Congress. They could not achieve it. The first time they tried to remove him, just 5 months in his government, they got 55 votes. So they could not remove him. The second time was earlier this year. They tried to remove him, and this was also some 64 or something votes. So they could not remove him. And they were to debate another motion of impeaching the president on 7th of December itself. And there was every possibility that they would not get the required amount of votes. But what happened was that Castillo, at around 11 a.m. that day, announced, in an address to the nation, that he is going to temporarily dissolve the Congress and launch a government of exceptional emergency. Okay, so it was this that many of the Congress people who were from parties that supported Castillo voted in favor of removing him. So finally, that motion got 101 votes.
Wait, quick clarification. So obviously, yes. So obviously, he's not being allowed to govern Castile. He decides, okay, I need to dissolve Parliament and enact temporary emergency measures so I actually can govern, and so I actually can govern the country. I was elected, darn it. But you're saying that that some of his very allies in the Congress then decide to side with the far right in de facto impeaching Castile, and yeah.
Yes, exactly. The parties, his own party, Peru Libre. I don't think anyone from Peru Libre voted against him, but there were the Peru Libre itself got fractured during this time. So there was this party called Peru Democrático, which got fractured from the Peru Libre. And then there was also a party called Bloque Magisterial with 10 Congress people who also originally belonged to Peru Libre, but decided to form their own bloc. So these people voted against him. And there is this party called Somos Peru, which have five Congress people in the Congress. 4 of them voted against him. The only one who did not was Betsy Chavez, who was named prime minister recently by Castillo, and who has been one of a very close associate of Castillo from day one, and before that also. So Betsy Chavez is the only person of that party who did not vote against him. The 4 others did. So yes, there were around 15 people who initially who were with Castillo ended up voting against him. And then there were a few independent Congress people who also, Castillo had favored independent Congress people so that he could pass some of his laws. So these people also voted against him. Now, I must say, I'll get to give to Jesus the way to describe the legal things. I will just say one thing, that the people who had voted for Castillo, they had been demanding from day one that like close the Congress and govern the country, give us the Constituent Assembly. So this demand has been in the Peruvian political scene for more than a year. So it's not like Castillo woke up one fine day and decided to dissolve Congress. There was this demand. He should have done it ages ago. Like when he did, like I wrote, when he did, his hands were tied. He like they had closed the circle against him. So there was every possibility that he would be in a very bad situation, just like he is now. So I'm not saying Jesus here, but anyway. So
unbelievable. Yes. For our 1+1 audience,
okay, yes, he's back. So
Jesus's internet's being a bit erratic. A lot of that's due to unjust Venezuelan sanctions. So Jesus, anything you want to add to what Saheli was? Anything you want to add to
that?
I apologize for my internet. Yeah, I mean, Saheli have a great understanding of what has been happening in Peru, and everything that she have said is completely accurate. I just would add that Castillo did the right thing. I mean, they are accusing Castillo of, orchestrating a coup d'etat because he ordered the dissolution of Congress, but it wasn't it was and it is in the Constitution of Peru in Article 134, and he, if you read what he said, if you watch what he said, you will notice that he was following the instructions. You can criticize Castillo in many fronts, but I believe that. But one thing is, criticizing his mistakes. Another thing is not recognizing all the things that Saheli just said about all the aggression against him, because basically he is, as President Petro said, a poor people, a person that comes from the mountains of Peru, where the poor people lives, and that are like despised by the elite in Lima because they call them the cholos. There was a nice piece that we published yesterday, I believe, about the revolution of the cholos, which is in response to what is happening right now when the people mobilizing, demanding what Castillo just did. I mean, demanding a new constitution, the dissolution of Congress, and that's very important. I mean, so I believe that it's important to highlight that Castillo is in jail, but is in jail because of a coup d'etat, orchestrated by a Congress that was already dissolved by him. So the question is, ¿quién puso el huevo? La gallina, we say in Spanish, like, who put the egg, there's a saying here about that. I mean, who is the blame? At the end of the day, I believe that the blame is the Congress that did not respect the constitutional decision of Castillo of dissolving the Congress. And he was calling for a constituent assembly, which is something that is also very important to highlight. It was his main promise. And people are right now in the street asking for that. And Saheli also mentioned the problem of the colonial heritage. It's important to highlight that Mexico and Peru, Lima, were the capitals of the biggest colonial centers during the colony time, and the elite and the court and all the oligarchy, all the elite that was created around Lima and around Mexico. We have this saying in Latin America, are very conservative, very and very strong, and that's why you have these two countries in one country, that the way we are seeing it in Peru, for example. So, but the reality is that Peru is like 90% cholos and maybe 1% the elite of Lima. So you have to take that into consideration. And it's important also to highlight the issue of the Constituent Assembly, because I mean, there's people that believe that, because I'm thinking about a piece that we published by Clodoaldo Hernandez talking about Venezuela and what happened in Venezuela and why a coup d'etat like the one that happened to Castillo has not happened here. And one of the scenes, among many scenes, that Clodovaldo Hernandez wrote was the Constituent Assembly commitment of Chavez. He mentioned many other things, like like explaining why these coup attempts, these foreign intervention have not paid results in Venezuela, and have been working a lot in other countries. And I believe that what he said is important because I mean he highlighted that Chavez committed to since the very beginning to achieve the constitutional, I mean, the writing of the new constitution. And that was not an easy task. There were some people, claiming on Twitter when we published that piece that Chavez had the military on his side and it was a piece of cake. That's a big lie. That's an extremely big lie because we didn't, I'm actually thinking about doing a show for Orinoco.
I think Jesus's internet has gone down a bit, but we're going to wait. We'll make sure that he finishes his thoughts. But very interesting. But then temporary changing subject. Then for a bit, Saheli, I then have to ask. I'm curious. What has been the response of member states of the EU, the EU itself, Spain, Canada, and so forth? Do they all back this coup that took place in Peru? And another stupid question, but what has been the White House and Whitehall's response to all of this?
Okay, so I think we already know what, like we can guess what their response would be. The European Union, and it was before the European Union, it's White House, of course, that has that called the Castillo's decision to dissolve Congress as the coup, and the decision of the Congress to oust Castillo as constitutional. So that is what the European Union and the White House both have called it. The Organization of American States, which is called the U.S. Ministry of Colonies, it also has backed the coup d'etat in Peru against Castillo. It said that Castillo was doing the unconstitutional thing, and the Congress has done the right thing by removing him because it has restituted democracy in Peru. That is what Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of Organization of American States, has said. So we can guess because they actually did not want.
And the EU as well. The EU as well has more or less backed the coup.
And it's also very funny that since Castillo's vice president, Dina Boluarte, has been placed in his place, she is a woman. So all these organizations, as well as Western media and its vassals in the other parts of the world, calling it like a very feminist thing. The coup is a very feminist thing because it is through this coup that a woman has become the president of Peru for the very first time. So they are not looking at the betrayal that this person, Dina Boluarte, has committed, not just against Castillo, but also against her own voters, because she was the vice president. She ran together with Castillo in the elections. People had voted for them both. So she has betrayed her electorate, her people, her everyone. So basically,
thank you very much for clarifying that because that got me very confused as to where exactly she lies in all this. So I'm very glad that you mentioned that. And
I would ask Jesus to continue.
Yes, Jesus, you're yes.
No, Go ahead, Youri.
You finish about the Constituent Assembly.
I just wanted to mention.
Oh, damn it.
Anyway, I can actually finish what you wanted to talk about the Constituent Assembly, but I won't. So I could just say why a Constituent Assembly is important, was important for Peru.
Please
because
do.
I was going to say that why are the people demanding a Constituent Assembly? Because, just like I mentioned, in Peru, every power of the state, of the economic power and everything has been entrenched in the oligarchy since independence. So it's in the white oligarchy that controls all the powers of the state and all the economic power, as well as the power of media. Like in Peru, like almost 80% of media is owned by this group called El Comercio, and it has newspapers, it has online outlets, it has radio stations and television channels. So it's a very powerful entity in itself. And the other one that controls the other, like almost 18% of the Peruvian media scene, is La República, which originally had started as a more leftist group, but at present it's also a neoliberal. And that so in Peru, media is very powerful and is controlled by the very same oligarchy that also controls all the other powers of the state as well as the economic power. So all this is reflected in the constitution itself. So the constitution of Peru, actually, like the constitution of the US, it not only recognizes private property, it also places private property above the power of the state. So the state is supposed to protect private property. And let's remember that by private property, one does not mean a house or a shop owned by a poor person, or a land owned by a farmer, for example. So by private property, you know what it means. It means industries, it means natural resources owned by very few people. So most of the power of the economy is owned by this oligarchy itself, and that is supported and protected by the constitution. Okay, and it also gives like in the 1993 constitution, the foreign mining interests were given powers in the country that they won't be controlled by the state, that they can take away anything from the state without paying taxes or paying very minimum amount of taxes. They won't be fined in case they commit environmental damages, etc. So these things are in the constitution and they are protected. Like there's all these interests, foreign multinational interests, are protected by the constitution of Peru, and the Fujimorista constitution, just like these things are protected in Chile by the Pinochetista constitution. Pinochet was the dictator of Chile. So this is very same. The two countries have very similar history and very similar constitutions. So most of the people, like Jesus mentioned, like the 90% of the people, more than 90% of the people, because the middle class has also suffered a lot. So most people of Peru do not really have power. So it's like the 99% versus the 1% in the constitution also. So most people of Peru actually want the constitution to change, and like so that the state has the powers and it gives people the power to control the state and not this oligarchy. So similarly, the oligarchy actually gave Congress a lot of power just in case that there is a president who goes against these interests and tries to do something for the people. So in this like Congress has the power to remove the president for moral incapacity. What does that even mean? But it gives the armed forces a lot of power. Armed forces are supposed to be under the president, but it has given the armed forces powers against the president. And it's not just the 93 constitution, it was similar in the 79 constitution, it was similar in the constitution before that. Like Peru has had a lot of constitutions, but all of them were oligarchic constitutions. So this is the reason why Constituent Assembly is demanded in Peru, in Chile, in many countries around the region. And this is why the Constituent Assembly was also important in Venezuela, because it actually gave the state the tools to protect itself
and
as
actually,
well as
hold
the
it,
people.
and actually hold that thought for one moment. Let's see if Jesus's internet's working. Jesus, are you there? I hope.
We hope. I think his bandwidth is very low.
Okay. Right now, Jesus is still having internet problems, but let me just test one again. Jesus, speak if you can hear us. Okay, we can't hear you for the time being, but that's okay. Well, Jesus, the moment your internet's working and we can hear you speak, do jump in, because you've had a very interesting thing to say about Venezuela's Constituent Assembly, how it was depicted as Chavez and Maduro being dictators. But until then, yes, Saheli, continue to explain what you were explaining about how important a Constituent Assembly is across Latin America.
So, for example, in Peru, there is also this demand of agrarian reform. So the agrarian reform it's not just about giving lands to peasants, it's also about protecting them, and it's also about giving them every other thing so that they can control the agricultural system and not foreign interests.
That is
This
perfect.
all that-
Jesus, jump in right now. Finish what you were saying about Venezuela's Constituent Assembly, how it was depicted as Chavez and Maduro being communist dictators. Explain
If
right
the
now.
internet let me.
Exactly.
If the internet let me.
Exactly. Go ahead. Yours.
I wanted to say that we didn't even have the chance in the Constitution to have consultations, public consultations, referendum that was not there in our 69 Constitution, the Constitution previous to the one that was written by Chavismo. We didn't have that allowed openly to have a constituent process, and that was a very complicated process. Chavez had to coquetear, to flirt with the elite at the time in order to push towards a decision from the High Tribunal of Venezuela to approve finally at some point the constituent process, and that was a complex process, and many also say that Chavez had the military on his side, and that's a big lie. I mean, Chavez didn't have the military. I mean, he was a military man, that's right, but that he didn't have the military at his side at that time, at least. He maybe 5 or 6 years later, after all the coup attempts against him, and putting a lot of those coup plotters from the military in prison, maybe the military began to be depurated somehow, but at the beginning, Chavez didn't have that support from the elite in the military, and the process was complex. That's why I believe that making a show about the constituent process in Venezuela might be interesting, because I believe that might be used to try to show the importance of the constituent process, which is something that Castillo didn't do. You might explain it for different reasons. I believe that he is.
Okay, I think Jesus's internet's down again, but I just wanted to say, after he was going to be done, explain that in the future, let's do a 1+1 Orinoco Tribune crossover show where we actually talk about that, and Jesus will give that presentation, and I'll have some questions prepared for it, because that's very fascinating. And Saheli, I wasn't even going to mention this, but doesn't this go back into the heart of the fact that Venezuela, that Hugo Chavez and Maduro had much more of a mandate to do the kind of democratic changes that was necessary for Venezuela, unlike Brazil, unlike Brazil, or unlike Bolivia. Well, you're shaking your head, so go ahead and
no,
yes.
actually, he didn't. He won the election of 1998, but he didn't have the National Assembly with him. At the time, it was like the Parliament of Venezuela was not even called the National Assembly. It was also called Congress, and he did not really have the legislative support for his thing. Just like as you say, there is no legal provision. Unlike Peru, where despite the constitution being a very right-wing thing, in the constitution of Peru, you do have provisions to change it. It does not say how you can change it, but you do have provisions to change it. You do have the right, like the president or the people actually have the right to call for a referendum on a constituent assembly by collecting signatures. This thing did not exist in the Punto Fijísimo constitution, like the constitution of the Fourth Republic of Venezuela. So actually, in legality, Castillo did have legality on his side, unlike Chavez. Chavez did not have it. So like Jesus said, he had to go to the Supreme Tribunal, the Supreme Court at that time, the Constitutional Court of Venezuela at that time, in order to have like some legality, in order to call for the process of Constituent Assembly.
Okay.
So, like it was a different structure. It wasn't the present structure of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela has a different structure of the state than the former one. So it has many things, like very many progressive things in the constitutions that didn't exist beforehand. So it wasn't like Chavez had a bigger mandate or a more support. He did not have either legality or mandate on his side. He won the election, But like Castillo also won the election, but he did not have these legal things with him.
Now, Jesus, what can you tell us? Thanks for clarifying that. Now, Jesus, what can you tell us about the large democratic uprisings taking place, led by the largely indigenous working class, and the violent suppression being meted out on them in Peru? I want your response, and Saheli, you can give your response, and then I have, and then I have 3 more questions left. Oh, but okay. Saheli, you responded, and Jesus will respond whenever the internet allows him to.
Okay, so
talk to us about the Peruvian democratic uprisings, the people power protests happening in Peru right now, and the violent suppression against them.
Okay, so just after the events of the 7th, starting from the 7th itself, that evening of 7th, when Castillo was arrested and taken to the penitentiary, from that moment, people actually started. Initially, they started in small groups protesting against the coup that has happened in Peru. They were not saying that Castillo had committed the coup. They were actually saying that the Congress had committed the coup that it was trying to do since Castillo, like even before Castillo had come to the presidency. And so what are their demands? Their demands still remain the same as at the time when they had elected Castillo, that they want a constituent assembly. But apart from the fact, they also want the Congress and the de facto president, Dina Boluarte, and her cabinet to resign. They want them to resign. They want Castillo to be liberated from prison and restituted to his position. And they also want general election to elect a legislative assembly, Congress, and they also want a constituent assembly. So these are the demands. Like they want the Congress to be closed. So they had been demanding this before. They are demanding it now also. And you may have seen that they have closed down highways, including the Panamericana Sur, which actually is runs into Chile. And they have also taken over airports and are trying to fighting with the security forces who did not support Castillo. So this is something in many countries of Latin America, I think all countries, that the army actually has a lot of power, and there have been many military coups in the region. So if you do not have the military with you, it's very difficult. That was true for Castillo also, and I'll come to that a bit later. I'll let Jesus speak, so because he might be cut off any moment by the U.S. sanctions.
Yes, Jesus, Jesus, talk to us about the Peruvian people power uprising that's happening.
Yes, I mean, I wanted to let me talk about something also important that which is this, dichotomy between the Lima oligarchy, and the U.S. interventionism. I want to mention this point because there was some people, some friends of us that try to diminish the role of the U.S. in these recent events happening in Peru, because the nature of the Lima oligarchy, they are nasty. That is true. I mean, no one denies it. I mean, they are the worst in Latin America, one of the worst. But I believe that that doesn't diminish the role of the U.S. in these coup attempts. I mean, and you have to put that in context, talking about Bolivia, talking about Argentina. I mean, yes, in the last 2 or 3 months, there has been coup attempts against democracy, and that that the U.S. and the CIA is behind that. What happened in Bolivia with the census and the protests in Santa Cruz, what happened to Cristina de Kirchner in Argentina, and what is happening in Peru, and you just have to read the tweets from the U.S. Embassy in Lima to understand what is happening. I mean, just go to the Twitter account of the U.S. Embassy in Lima, and you will notice, I mean, who supports what. So I mean, I just wanted to highlight that because it's important, because some people might believe that there was not U.S. intromission in what's happening in Peru, and of course there's always U.S. intromission because of what Saheli said at the beginning about.
It would be very silly to diminish anything that the U.S.
Yes,
does.
yes. Of course, the elite is nasty. The elite is nasty. Is one of the worst. But I mean, the U.S. is always there pushing for these things to happen because they don't care about democracy. That's the issue. They talk about democracy all the time.
Oh, darn it. Yes, typical. The U.S. and Britain and France and Canada always talks about democracy when they're anti-democracy, and also, Saheli, can you talk very briefly about the far-right uprising that's taking place in Bolivia and how the state in Bolivia is trying to respond to them? And of course, the obvious backers of those far-right uprisings, which are backed by the U.S., Canada, and so forth.
Okay, so in Bolivia, there has always been this separatist, right-wing separatist thing in Santa Cruz. It is in eastern province. So it's also the most the most of the economic activities of Bolivia is also concentrated in the province of Santa Cruz. So this province is actually so separatist because it is also the place where the most European origin people live. So there are East European people, and many of them had actually Nazi forefathers living. They had fled from.
Actually, Saheli, sorry
Europe.
to interrupt. I'm just going to interrupt you one bit. Jesus, finish whatever you were saying about the Peruvian people power uprisings and the
U.S.
I believe that I basically say what I wanted to say. I mean that you cannot diminish the role of the U.S. They have a say on that, and you can see it clearly. Just watching the statement of the U.S. ambassador, we have seen published several pieces about this U.S. intervention in the Peruvian affairs, and I just wanted to highlight that. I mean that you cannot, because how bad the Peruvian oligarchy is, you cannot diminish neither the role of the U.S. intervention because they are always behind everything and they just want to keep the control they usually have on all of our countries because that's the way that the U.S. has enriched itself. That's the way the U.S. has become an empire. And people have to understand that they don't care about democracy. They don't care about human rights. They just care about having control of everything. Go ahead, Sahi.
And
before I got caught.
Before we go back, before we change subject and we focus on Bolivia and Venezuelan sanctions, Jesus, do you think this will be the straw that breaks the camel's back? Do you think that this will finally be Peru's big democracy moments where they overthrow the oligarchy temporarily, just like Bolivia when they had the water wars, or Venezuela and so forth?
I believe that it's not going to be an easy task for Dina Boluarte. I mean, I believe that it's not going to be an easy task for the U.S. empire. But Peru is a complex country. I mean, and the Peruvian, the nature of the Peruvian ordinary people is somehow connected to the idiosynchasy of the Peruvian indigenous people that is very I don't know how to say it, submissive. The Quechua, the Aymara culture has been too submissive for too many centuries to colonial rule, to empires, now to the U.S. that I don't know. I hope.
Interesting. No, that's very interesting what Jesus was saying, and we'll get back to it once his internet comes back. So, Saheli, actually, anything you want to kind of add on to what Jesus was saying, and then explain us again of about
Bolivia. Okay, so I think we had published this article from Social News about the Peruvian U.S. ambassador in Peru being a CIA person, and she had served in Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, like many places where the US has actually carried out wars and destroyed countries. So she is a person who is like who has been involved in this, who is an expert in destroying countries. So they sent her in April 2021 to Peru. Probably they did not expect Castillo to win, but there was a possibility that the left may gain some space in the Peruvian political scene, like the highest scenes of the Peruvian political situation. So probably that is why they sent her. But she is a person, like I should mention her name, like it's Lisa Kenna, and she is a person who is an expert in Middle Eastern and African affairs because she has been in these countries serving for the CIA. So they have sent a CIA person to Peru, and I think that that's a very that's an indicator how important Peru is for the US and Canada, for especially for its economic interests. There's like oil, lithium, everything. So they will not easily give up their mining interests in Peru. And the people of Peru are against a very strong, the strongest adversary possible. Like the US empire is stronger than the Spanish empire. The capital of the viceroyalty of Peru was in Lima. So it is a power center, but it is the US that's the power center, and it wants Peru to remain under its control. So it is a very, very like uphill task for the people of Peru. And there is always the repression by the police and the military. So Dina Boluarte, she is a facade. So she has been kept at the forefront, but like the things that she's doing, I think it's the US and like people from them who are advising her to do those things. So she has declared like she doesn't have agency, and also Congress controls her. Keiko Fujimori expressed her support for Boluarte. So it's the right wing that's controlling
for me. It's very odd that once again we have that once again Latin America's the Latin American left. There's a lot of enemies from within, as they say, and what's happened in Peru reminds me so much of what happened in Ecuador when you had Lenin Moreno, the vice president of Rafael Correa, very popular leftist president, and then Lenin Moreno was was a traitor. I mean, there's nothing else you can say, and then he paved the way for neoliberal takeover. But Jesus, you were saying something about the strength. You were saying something about the indigenous people of Peru and how, for some reason, they tend to be much more submissive over the power structure. Finish what you were saying about that, and then we'll talk about Bolivia, and then Venezuelan sanctions, and then we can wrap this up. But say what you want to say.
Yes. I mean, basically, what I was trying to say is that I'm not too optimistic that this movement, this uprising might end up, pushing for real changes in Peru. I hope that I'm wrong. And I've seen a lot of mobilizations and a lot of police repression. I mean, the last figure that I saw was like 25 people dead, but that's the official numbers, and you have to pay attention to that because you always know that they might try to hide some deaths also. So I hope that there will be change, but I don't know. I'm not that optimistic. So go ahead, Saheli.
All right.
Or you, Youri.
On to Bolivia. And actually, Saheli, just from the top, you were saying about how in Bolivia, because there's a far right uprising that's taking place, and that is happening in a region of Bolivia, Santa Cruz, which has a very right-wing separatist movement. Talk to us about that and how the Bolivian state and the people power movement behind it are trying to combat that.
Okay, so this time, like the people who are trying to do the coup in Bolivia this time are the same people who did it in 2019 and who had also tried it during 2006, 2008. So these are the same people, remember. So these are the same people who had removed Morales and who had tried to remove him before also, and like who had also tried to do a coup in Bolivia during its constituent assembly process. So it's like this power that is within, trying to destroy the country from within, try to divide it into two parts. They actually even did it once, I think in 2010 or 11. There were people from Europe, like from Croatia, from Romania, etc., and also people with nationalities from both Bolivia and those countries who had tried to carry out an uprising, and whom Evo Morales had to send the military in order to capture them, and some people were killed. And this case went to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, and they actually have come up with this thing that Evo Morales had committed a crime or something. So Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is actually an arm of the OAS itself. So it's an arm of the US. So let's just not care about them too much. But apart from that, at present, this is also an oligarchy, okay? So this is the oligarchy of Bolivia, the entrenched oligarchy of Bolivia. And the oligarchy exists in all countries of Latin America, irrespective of like how much, like whether a socialist rules the country or not. So,
and they're also and also important to add, there's no such thing as center rights, like Christian Democrats or conservative. They're all far right. There's no,
actually there are Christian Democrats, but they are far right.
Exactly.
There is no normal right wing in Latin America. They're all fascist right wing. It does not matter how they describe themselves. They are all fascists. So these fascists of Bolivia, led by the governor of Santa Cruz, Luis Fernando Camacho, who was one of the coup perpetrators of 2019, is this time also trying to destabilize the country over an excuse that's so stupid that you won't believe it. It's the census. So the census was supposed to have taken place this year. Should have started this year. So they have a census every 10 years, I think. So last one happened in 2012, and the next one was supposed to happen this year. But because of the pandemic, there was like the institutional processes that should have started before the census could not be done. So the government said that it will postpone the census to March 2024, and it will start the processes now so that the census could be started at that time. So this right wing just started to, actually they had, even before that, they were actually trying to say that the government of Bolivia, which is, Bolivia is an indigenous majority country, and the government of Bolivia is like the president, etc. They're all indigenous people, and most people in the government and in powers are the indigenous people. So the right wing of Santa Cruz for a long time had been trying to say that they're trying to show the numbers of indigenous peoples as higher, so that, like they're just trying to say that the indigenous peoples are being treated as first-class citizens and they are being treated as second-class, etc. So this was originally, and so they are using the census as the excuse to go against the government. Initially, they were like saying, no, we want the census to start now, etc., because we are very committed to democracy and people's rights. But after that, when the government was discussing with all the heads of the governments of the different departments, the governor of Santa Cruz did not go. And instead, he and his people started instigating this coup in order to get rid of the government of Bolivia, of Luis Arce. But there is also a problem within the Movimiento Socialismo, the party of Evo Morales, which is that, well, first of all, the new government, the government of Luis Arce, should not have allowed Camacho to run as the governor of Santa Cruz, because the governorship elections took place after the presidential elections. They took place in late 2021, I think. So they should not have allowed this person to run. This is a coup plotter, coup perpetrator. He bragged about it on TV. So he should have been in prison, just like Giannini Áñez, the de facto president, is in prison. And they're also trying to get Murillo from, I think, Brazil. So this person should not have been the governor. So actually the Latin American leftist governments do have this, I think, weakness of using the mano dura, the hard hand, because they should be applying the law against these people. Like if the law is harsh against coup perpetrators, because coup perpetrators actually are betraying the nation, they should be in prison. Just like, I mean, these laws should be applied as harshly as they are in the,
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
whatever there. So this weakness exists. Apart from that, within mass itself, there is this weakness. Some people are saying that the government should have started this, what is it called, the census process already, and some people were saying not. And there was, for some time there was this speculation that some of the Congress people from within mass would be voting against the government. It did not happen finally, so I'm happy that the unity was maintained, but there was the distinct possibility of this happening. So the party itself should be working towards mending these internal divisions, and the government should also has to do something about weaknesses, because in this case it was not the government that was the first responder against this coup attempt. It was the trade unions of Santa Cruz itself, that tried to stop the coup attempt this time. The government responded later. So there was this criticism from the social movements that it was not responding as it should have, at least initially. So there was all these things, bad things. These are the weaknesses of all Latin American governments, including the Venezuelan one, not using the law harshly, giving pardons to people who do not deserve it, and all these things. I mean, in many cases, it is actually humanitarian. On humanitarian grounds, it is done. But someone like Camacho should not have been allowed to run for the governorship. And I cannot insist this enough. And there are people in Bolivia who cannot insist this enough, that he should not have been allowed to run, that Romulo Calvo, the other person.
Do you think the governments of Bolivia and it's funny to hear that to hear someone say that Venezuela's been also too soft against the coup plotters. Do you think that the reason why they have been soft on judicial crimes and all these right-wing and all this right-wing sabotage is because they're afraid of the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watches of the world depicting
Actually,
them
not
as
them, but they're actually afraid of US invasions, like military invasions. And this is also something that this Venezuelan journalist Clodovaldo Hernandez had pointed out, that the Venezuelan government, he was talking about the Venezuelan government, and he said that it's like a mother whose child has been kidnapped, and the kidnapper is like holding the child at gunpoint and forcing the mother to do things that she would not otherwise have done. So this woman is trying to, like manage both sides so that the child can be saved, and at the same time she is not going to destroy her own ideals and anything. So she is not going to destroy her own child's life, as well as she is not going to destroy anything. So this is the sort of comparison that Hernandez had done, and it's actually very true. So like, it's not like Amnesty International or anything. I mean, blockades are already terrible, so it's already an act of war. So they're also afraid of US invasions. So that's a big thing we have to always take into account, that there is always the possibility of military invasions, not just coup from within. The US tried to invade Venezuela in 2020.
yeah.
Let's not forget the Operation Gideon. So this is what actually it does. Like governments, they actually have to walk a tightrope, because the financial powers, geopolitical powers, etc., they do not lie in Latin America, they lie in the global north. And these governments have to get loans and credits from financial institutions. They have to have their representation in the United Nations and other international bodies, which are also dominated by the North. So, it is these things which these governments have to maintain. And at the same time, it also has to carry out processes that benefit their own people. So that is the sort of thing. For example, you will see, if you look at the voting charts at the United Nations General Assembly, you will be seeing that Venezuela has not been able to vote the entire year. It has not been able to vote on Palestine. It has not been able to vote on Cuba. It has not been able to vote on Russia. It has not been able to vote on anything this year. You know why?
Wow.
Because the US blockade, the US Office of Foreign Assets Control of the US Treasury has blocked the funds with which Venezuelan government was going to pay its membership fee at the UN. So if you do not pay your membership fee for 2 consecutive years, you cannot vote at the UN General Assembly. So this is what has happened to Venezuela. This is what has happened to Yemen. This is what has happened to Sudan, many countries, that the funds with which they were going to pay, those accounts were blocked. So they could not pay the membership fees at the United Nations. In fact, the government of Venezuela has criticized the UN and criticized the Secretary General Antonio Guterres that he's not doing anything about this thing. So these are the things. These are the things that these governments have to deal with. So it's like they're soft I believe because of this reason. Like they have to walk a tightrope and manage many things. It's impossible to believe them, but like they're so incredible, but they are real.
My last question, and hopefully hopefully Jesus hopefully Jesus is allowed to come back for that. My last question is: Venezuela, as you mentioned, is still under sanctions from the US, the UK, EU, Canada, Australia, and so forth, correct?
Yeah. True.
And so that being said, can you talk about how the Maduro government is trying to bypass that, and how ridiculous some of these sanctions are, in that it's affecting the sports culture of Venezuela, like basketball and volleyball, and then update us on the current. Yes, I know it's going to be hard for people to believe, but there's a new round of sanctions called the
Bolivar Act.
Talk to us about that, and when Jesus comes, hopefully he can also enlighten us about it.
Okay, so there are 943 sanction measures on Venezuela at this moment. Okay, wow. Just imagine the number, 943. I think it's the 6th highest. It used to be the 5th highest, but Russia got the first position now with more than 8,000 sanctions on them. So Venezuela got the 6th position. So 943 sanction measures include the Venezuelan oil industry, the entirety of it. So the PDVSA and all its subsidiaries and all its bank accounts in foreign countries. So any bank account in which there is a dollar has been sanctioned by the Office of Foreign Assets Control of the US Treasury. So, it cannot get its money from any of those accounts in other countries. Okay, so its foreign assets are all frozen. There are sanctions on the Venezuelan aviation industry. There are sanctions on Venezuelan mining industries, on manufacturing, on the currency Bolivar, the national currency Bolivar itself. There are sanctions on Venezuelan, all sorts of industries, including the private sector. So the US talks about protecting private property and saying that the Venezuelan government is such a dictatorial government that it is reflecting the Soviet Union, but it isn't. There is private property in Venezuela. Like, in fact, most of the economic sector is in private hands. So most of it is not the big private ones, and it's okay. Like, you can have malls, so people can own pharmaceutical companies, people can own shops and everything. So these things, like the private sector, is also sanctioned, and like Venezuela's pharmaceuticals, everything is sanctioned. So it's everything. And they say that food and medicine would be out of the sanction regime, but that isn't true. The Venezuelan government, let's remember, like these are also colonial legacies, that Venezuela has huge plain lands, but in most of the plain lands, Venezuela, like the agricultural system was geared towards exporting things. So coffee, its fruits were planted in those lands instead of wheat, corn, rice, etc. So these things, Venezuela used to import rice, wheat, maize from the US, from Archer Daniel Midlands, Cargill. These companies had their subsidiaries, like their own companies inside Venezuela. They were expropriated, but they used to be there. And this was something that had been happening before colonialism, like Spain had done this. So the US had maintained this. And it was not until the agrarian reform that it started to change. So even after agrarian reform, things don't change overnight. So even now, it had to, and like most countries cannot cultivate everything. So it has to import some things also. Now, when it is importing food or medication from outside, and in the in the Caribbean Sea, there are U.S. vessels, U.S. Navy vessels that chased those ships when they were trying to go into the when they're trying to enter the Venezuelan international waters. So this has happened, although it may seem incredible and it is not talked about anywhere. This has happened. So it isn't like these things are outside of sanctions. Similarly, like the US sanctions also state that any company or any corporation in which it has more than 10% stake cannot export anything or sell anything to the Venezuelan government or any sanctioned entity of Venezuela, whether they be a public or a private entity. So for example, there was this Swiss company which used to sell, what is it called, insulin to Venezuela. And a US pharmaceutical company acquired like some 50% shares, and it overnight stopped selling insulin to Venezuela. So Venezuela now gets all of its insulin from Russia. And it used to get things from Russia before also, but it had to change everything overnight to get these things from Russia. For example, like these are big problems, then there was this another company from Switzerland that used to sell water pumps and pipes for the water supply system in Venezuela. It used to sell it to the Venezuelan government because the water supply system is a public system. When the sanctions came, these companies refused to sell Venezuela a single bolt. Okay? So the water supply system, it's a big thing, and it's something that if a single valve or a single pipeline has some problem in it, the entire units go down. So you have to replace it. A time came when there were no more spare parts left, and there were sanctions so that the government could not import anything. So and like countries like China or Russia or India or Iran or other places from where it can import things, it isn't like these governments own shipping lines or anything. So these shipping companies, they are also getting sanctioned by the US because they are taking things from, for example, China to Venezuela. So these sanctions, the US sanctions, are applied extraterritorially. Like they are not just applicable in the US dominion, they are not just applicable against Venezuela, they're also applicable against third parties and third countries that have nothing to do with anything. So, there is always
unbelievable.
There's always an over compliance with sanctions because many companies, especially private companies, are afraid that they will be sanctioned, which means that their assets in either US banks or in international financial institutions, because the US is the dominant power in all international financial institutions. They were set up after the World War II, and the US was the only big power that was unaffected mostly, although they may pretend that wasn't so. Anyway, so these organizations, like these companies, are afraid that their assets will be seized by the US Treasury. They are afraid that their things will be seized, and this has happened. Like some oil company, that was carrying oil from Iran was like intercepted
Seized.
by the Greek Coast Guard under the US orders. So it had to keep it there, and Iran was not taking it to Venezuela, it was sending it to Yemen, and it was seized by the Greek Coast Guard. Like it finally went to Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. But it was seized for like 2 months, and there was like the Iran seized 2 Greek ships, and only after this Manodura something happened. So you have to sometimes be harsh. Anyway, so like, these sort of things happen, and although they may seem unbelievable, they're true. So anything that the Venezuelan government tries, or any Venezuelan entity or even person, because the SWIFT system does not work for Venezuela. So people like Venezuelan people living outside the country, if they want to send money to their own people, like their families, like it's very difficult to send it. They have to send it through 5-6 different ways in order for the money to reach them. And even after that, that takes a long time. And you have to pay more charges because you have been instead of doing it in a very direct manner, you have to do it in a roundabout manner. So the cost of everything increases. This is also true for every import that Venezuela makes. It cannot import, for example, it cannot import entire machinery. It has to import parts from different places and assemble it within the country so that, the sanctions do not affect those countries, so that those countries continue to sell things to Venezuela. This is true for Cuba also. This is true for Nicaragua. This is true for all the 39 countries that are under US sanctions at this moment, not just US, Canada, European Union, Australia, New Zealand, the usual suspects. So,
but briefly, if it's possible, what is the Maduro government trying to do to bypass the sanctions, and then talk very briefly about the ridiculous sanctions, even sports or sanctions like the Venezuelan volleyball team and the Venezuelan basketball team.
Okay, those sanctions, let me just talk about those sanctions on the teams, is that the governments that are very servile to the US government, like Panama, for example, or Costa Rica, they refuse to grant visas to these people, like to the volleyball players or the basketball players of Venezuela. So when they refuse to grant them visas, these teams cannot, of course, go and they cannot compete. So that is the sanctions. They also try to do it to the Olympics. That hasn't happened yet, but so Venezuelan players can compete in the Olympics. But for example, there have been times when Venezuelan officials, including the foreign affairs minister, were not granted visa by the Netherlands in order to go to The Hague to attend, hearings at the International Criminal Court. And The Hague Netherlands did not give visas because the US, they were afraid of US sanctions themselves.
Wow. Ah, my gosh.
Now let me talk about the Bolivar Act, because you named it they named it after the father of the Venezuelan independence.
I'm also going to make sure to post 2 articles about the ridiculous sports sanctions. But yes, onto the Bolivar Act, and then we can wrap this up.
So the Bolivar Act was introduced by this Republican senator. I think his name is Rick Scott. So it is a Republican senator. The Senate is still controlled by Democrats, but it unanimously passed it. So they unanimously passed this act, which is which is about not having any contact with the criminal regime of Venezuela. So that is the act, and they named it after Bolivar, the father of Venezuelan independence, and not just Venezuelan independence. He's considered the father of independence of Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, then Ecuador, like all these countries. So Paraguay, like all these countries were considered Bolivar to be their liberator, even like Argentina and all. So it's like he is a person who is respected and commemorated everywhere, who is considered a symbol of independence. So they named it after him, and that is a big disrespect, of course. But the US does not they would have liked to. Remember, Bolivar actually had got help from the US in his wars against Spain, but that's the thing. And so
the irony.
You will see the bipartisan nature of the US war government. When it is when the Senate unanimously passes a resolution against the government of Venezuela, calling it a criminal regime, an elected government. So it's calling an elected government a criminal regime. Well, the US election system is there is no system. Okay, so the US itself does not allow international observation of its elections, right? The Venezuelan government does. There are also people from the US, including the Carter Center, observing elections in Venezuela. So despite all these things, it continues to call the government of Venezuela a criminal regime, and it's not going to have any contact with them. I think this comes because in recent times, the Biden administration has been trying to get closer to Venezuela for its own interests, for oil interests, because there is all this trouble with Russia. The government of the US used to get most of its oil and gas, a lot of its oil and gas from Russia. The European Union, you yourself know, used to get all of its stuff from Russia. So just now that it is in a disarray, this system, so they will continue to get it through third parties. Of course, this happens all the time, but it's trying to get closer to other countries that have oil. So Venezuela, it's a part of OPEC. So OPEC has decided to drastically reduce its production so that it's like the oil price does not go down very much. And it's in a way it is challenging the US domination in the market. So it's the US friend, Saudi Arabia, who is also like a big member of OPEC. It is the one actually that came up with the resolution to reduce production. So the US is saying that its own allies are behaving like this. They're trying to actually, it's not like Saudi Arabia is suddenly becoming a big anti-imperialist, not at all. It's just trying to protect its natural resources. Like none of us would want to give up our natural resources as if they were nothing, to give away these things. Nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to maintain prices. So in order to maintain the price of this thing, they're reducing the production so that, the demand will always be high, so that, they would continue to get high prices, because the US is trying to put a cap on oil prices in the international market. And G7 is trying to do it. Of course, G7 is just 7 countries. Most of them are not oil producers. And even if there are, they will not be like, they would not like to increase their production because they know that they will suffer. So in this situation, what the US was doing is that it was authorizing foreign companies like Repsol, which is a Spanish oil company, and Eni, which is the Italian oil company. The US was authorizing them to restart their operations in Venezuela. And they do have some, what is it called, joint ventures with the PDVSA in Venezuela. In these cases, it's the law in Venezuela that the PDVSA will be the majority shareholder, so that decision-making power remains with the Venezuelan government, but foreign companies can be part of the joint ventures. So Repsol, Eni, as well as many others, Rosneft, the Russian one, Rosneft is in Venezuela, Reliance Industries, which is an Indian, it's a private company, it's in Venezuela. It has some of its joint ventures in Venezuela, like many companies actually. The Iranian national oil company has its ventures in Venezuela. Chevron, the US oil company, has its ventures in Venezuela. So Biden recently also authorized Chevron to restart its operations in Venezuela. So seeing all these things, the Republicans are trying to make this an issue, so that it can appeal to its own support base, that it is the one that is trying to uphold democracy and human rights around the world. So in Venezuela, it's trying to uphold democracy and human rights. So it has to go against the criminal regime of Venezuela. That is why it had to come up with this ridiculously named, disrespectfully named act to cut down all sorts of contacts between the government of Biden and the government of Maduro. And, I think I should mention this, and many people forget it, that back channels always exist. Even among the worst enemies of the world, back channels exist. So there were back channel talks, even after Obama had declared Venezuela an extraordinary threat against its national security. So back channels existed even during Trump. They have continued to exist under Biden. So the Republicans are trying to make it a show that it is the one, it is the real democratic power in the US, and I think it's geared towards the 2024 elections. So it wants to come back to power surely. So that's why it will try to do anything possible, and it's doing this. It's trying to, it's trying to mess up everything every time that anyone has tried to as a bridge, like create a bridge between Russia and Ukraine. Anytime Biden actually thought of giving some, giving some time and effort for the Iran nuclear deal, etc. So everywhere, you have seen that some Republican congressman or senator has come up with an act or a bill against these very countries for supposedly their democratic human rights abuses or something, or democratic deficiencies, and the House or the Senate or both have unanimously or overwhelmingly passed those bills, just exposing the warlike nature of both parties.
And finally, briefly, if it's possible, what though is the Maduro government trying to do to bypass all of these sanctions? Because I'm curious how they're trying to survive and help out their people while there's all these ridiculous economic terrorism that's being inflicted on them.
Okay, so it's economic war. It's actually called a hybrid war because the war is in many fronts. So except open bombing, everything has happened. So it's a hybrid war. And what has the government tried to do? Like, there are many things actually it has tried to do. Let's start with the internal ones. Firstly, the government of Venezuela is trying to combat corruption at all levels, because in a situation of blockades, there are always people who try to take advantage of it and try to get money out of it. There are people who will always try to do that. It's trying to combat corruption both within the bureaucracy and in the economic powers. Then it's also trying to, what's it called? It's trying to boost agriculture. So Venezuela has actually increased production of maize, production of rice, wheat, meat, and all these things. So it's trying
because most of the sanctions have been on its fossil fuel industry.
The sanctions have been on everything. Okay. So since the supply chains, like the food supply chains, have been broken, the government of Venezuela is trying to boost agriculture inside Venezuela. So it's carrying on the land reform that had begun under Chavez, and it's also doing a broad, like a comprehensive agrarian reform, giving seeds to the farmers, etc. So there are also like indigenously produced seeds. Since it has banned genetically modified seeds, so it does not buy seeds from Monsanto or anyone. So I know there are indigenously produced seeds, and it's trying to give farming communities more power so that they can produce more and sell these things to Venezuela. Every parts of Venezuela, like in cities, etc. There is also, like within the cities also, there are communes, farming communes. So it's trying to boost agriculture within cities also, so that you do not have to transport things over long distances, because there are sanctions on fossil fuel industry. What it did was, okay, this is something that people forget. The Venezuelan oil industry was made by the US. Okay, so it was like the oil in Venezuela was discovered by Standard Oil, which is of the Rockefeller family. So when they described oil in Venezuela in 1920s, it started to develop the industry. And from the beginning of 1950s, the US government also promoted this because they wanted to teach Mexico a lesson. At the time, the president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, had nationalized the oil industry of Mexico. Before that, it was the US companies that used to control the oil industry of that country. So when it was nationalized, the US government tried to bypass Mexico. So it would no longer buy oil from them, starting a sort of oil sanctions against Mexico. And in this way, it will try to prove that public ownership of anything does not work, that governments are inept, they cannot do anything, they are corrupt, etc. Although there is more corruption well, corruption is actually something that originated from capitalism. So it built the oil industry in Venezuela. All the parts, like every component of the Venezuelan refineries were made in the US. So when the sanctions came, in 2016, the oil sanctions were declared in 2016. So when the oil sanctions first came, it was not just against buying and selling of oil. It was also against selling of spare parts. And when the US no longer was selling spare parts, it isn't like Venezuela could get the spare parts from Iran, for example. It just couldn't because they wouldn't match. So it had to, like the government of Venezuela had to do a comprehensive agreement with Iran and also with Russia so that engineers from those countries will renovate the refineries and other production systems so that you can buy parts from them and so that you can just continue to produce. So it took time. So initially, like starting from 2016, the oil industry was destroyed. Not just because Venezuela lost the market because it was cut off from the international market. No, it was also because a small thing, a small valve or a small tap or something going out of function meant that an entire refinery could go out of function and it could not get anything from the US, like any of those parts from the US. So, renovating the entire system is still taking place. And then in petrochemical industry, everything is still occurring. So it is doing that, like it's trying to do these things so that it can bypass the US. Like it does not need to get anything from the US. Right. It's also trying to, in the international arena, Venezuela is one of the pioneers of this group in the UN called Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. So it is this group which also has Syria, Russia, China, Yemen, Zimbabwe, well, all the sanctioned countries. They have made this group and they are trying to advocate against unilateral sanctions and how the unilateral coercive measures are destroying people. The Venezuelan government also has a case opened at the International Criminal Court against all the governments that have sanctioned the country, calling the unilateral coercive measures not just a human right violation, but a crime against humanity. So this is called the Venezuela 2 case, which is never mentioned anywhere in the media. Okay, so it's also trying to strengthen its friendships in Asia and Africa, as well as in Latin America, so that you will have friends to back you up against the enemies. And but so in the internal arena as well as in the international one, the government is trying to not just bypass but also present a face to the world that it is surviving and it's fighting. That is the main thing. And of course, I should also mention that it was like why the Constituent Assembly was so important. It says that it gave the government these powers. The earlier government could not, if the earlier constitution existed, the Constitution of 1961 existed, the government would not have been able to do it because it would not have been having these powers. It would not have been having the legal provisions. It could not have, for example, in 2015, the Chavismo lost the National Assembly election. It was a very bad time. So in 2015, the National Assembly went to the opposition. Okay, they became the majority. So there is a power of the state within the country that was colluding with the US, with Canada, with all the sanctioning. They were crying for sanctions. They wanted the sanctions. They wanted the sanctions against their own people. And they also unleashed violence in the streets. So in 2017, Maduro again called a Constituent Assembly to defend the country from the invaders as well as the traitors from within. So if the provision did not exist, this 2015 to 2020 term during this term of the National Assembly, if that provision did not exist, the US could have effectively colonized Venezuela, could have invaded the country, could have overthrown the government, could have done everything that it is now doing in Peru. It could not do because the provision of the Constituent Assembly was there. It could not, it had only violence in 2017. It was terrible violence. It had tried to, tried to derail the 2018 elections. The US did not recognize the 2018 election. It does not matter. It's an election. We do not go and say that we do not recognize the US elections. I mean, I don't, but we cannot do anything about it. But when the US says that it does not recognize the Venezuelan presidential elections, all the media start shouting that the elections were rigged or well, it was the opposition that boycotted the election. Nobody asked them to boycott. They were welcome to join it. They knew that they would lose because they had done so much harm to the country.
Self-inflicted damage, yeah.
So in 2018, the US did not recognize the election and brought more sanctions in 2019. And then Guaido declared himself president, although he had never run in a presidential election. And both the president and the vice president was there. Like Maduro was there, Delcy Rodriguez, who is the vice president, was there. So that is the line of succession. And Guaido was at that time the president of the National Assembly. So there was no way he could be president, but he still declared himself a president. And there were 60 countries in the world that recognized him. You can name the 60. You know who they are. So it's from 2019, the bigger sanctions came, and it was the National Constituent Assembly that saved Venezuela from, well, those sanctions also. Not that it could save the economy, that was destroyed, but the sovereignty was not. The country is still sovereign, independent, it's still trying to fight. And in 2020, of course, Chavismo won back the National Assembly, and now Guaido is not even being recognized by the US.
Well, that is a perfect. I think that's a perfect place to end. Unfortunately, as people can clearly see, Jesus's internet's not working. A lot of that is because of the sanctions on Venezuela. Has nothing to do with really good socialist policies, which our capitalist friends are decrying. But but before we wrap up, I just want to remind people that we are going to be going on a Christmas, New Year's hiatus break. So Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays to everyone. And Saheli, anything you want to say, pitches to Orinoco Tribune before we end this program? And I just also want to say that best of luck to all the people power movements in Latin America. Latin America deserves our solidarity. And to all the people who are living in Europe, Turtle Island, North America, that's the US and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, please get involved in people power movements and in solidarity campaigns and demand that their governments stop backing reactionary forces in Latin America and let those countries breathe, as as many people would say about Cuba, Haiti, and Venezuela. Saheli, the final word goes to you.
Okay, so of course I would invite all everybody that listens to you to read Orinoco Tribune. The website is orinocotribune.com, and we are also on all social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram, Reddit, and we also have a Discord server at present. You can join our Discord server from the website itself. The link is in the website. And also I'd like to remind you that please donate, because all the Wikipedia claims that Venezuelan government or something pays money to Orinoco Tribune. That's not true. So nobody pays, no government pays Venezuelan Orinoco Tribune any money. We depend entirely on donations from our readers and supporters. So it's a very bad time actually. Our donation annual fund drive is going on at the moment, and of course, for the moment, the goal is $200 a month. That's not much, and it goes into maintaining the stable internet that Jesus has. Well, it's not just that, but it goes into like this sort of things, not just internet. I mean, you need electricity, you need everything else. So it goes into this sort of like maintaining the website. You need to pay for the domain, for example. Okay, so and we also pay for this Zoom that Youri is using now, and so this all this thing comes from that. So please donate to us. We have PayPal, we have Patreon. Those things are in the website. So please go to the website. There is this thing called Support Us, as well as in the front page of the website, like homepage. There are also these links to donate to PayPal or become a patron. And also we have like we prefer something called not tax deductible donations that we do in partnership with the Alliance for Global Justice. That link is also in the Support Us. So any small amount actually counts, because at this moment there is inflation everywhere, including in Venezuela. Venezuela actually had the cumulative inflation this year at more than 155%. You imagine that. Of course, it's not hyperinflation. In 2019, it was 1 million%. You won't be able to imagine. But anyway, so at this moment, it's like 155% inflation, and there is this parallel black market and all these things, which exist in every blockaded country. So we need to fight these things also. Like we need to survive. So like please help us survive so that we can continue to report. For example, at this moment, like and we know that people are reading our Peru articles, for example, because those are becoming the top read articles in both news and opinion pieces. We are trying to cover that thing as much as we can, so like
and yes, and the Orinoco Tribune is also, I have to say, it's also very criminally underrated and very criminally overlooked independent news outlets, and people really should check them out. The YouTube channel is fantastic. The articles, many of them very short, are fantastic. So that's another pitch I would have to make. And 1+1, we're going to do one more show. Our final program is going to be tomorrow. I normally don't tease the guest, but we're going to be having Małgorzata Kubiczeska-Figetz of Transform Europe and the Barricade on to talk about Eastern European affairs. And that's about it. Merry Christmas to everyone, and please donate generously to Orinoco Tribune. And Saheli, to you and Jesus, thank you so much for coming back on the program. And I look forward to having you back on. I think we're going to have you back on either late in January or sometime in February to talk about Argentina, but also to talk more about what's going on in Peru. All right?
Okay, thanks a lot to you for having us. And you were so that people who follow you would also follow us. Like we hope so.
One can only hope. And keep doing
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you, your family, and all of your friends, and all the friends of 1+1.
And keep doing the fantastic work that you do.